Good morning, everybody here, and to those who are joining us via Zoom. Good afternoon or evening. My name is Amani Aljak, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the consortium, on behalf of Carol Cohn, Claire, and the consortium interns, to welcome you today to today's talk by Anna Del Conde. This is the first event of the consortium speaker series, the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights Spring 25 speaker series, which is organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, with support from Affirming Multifocal Humanities Mellon Grant. Would also like to thank many of the UMass departments, colleges that have, and programs that have co-sponsored this event and the other consortium events. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to say that UMass Boston and its surrounding communities are based on unceded homelands of Massachusetts, Potawatomi, and Neboik communities. We want to honor the diverse indigenous people enduring relationships with their traditional ancestor territories land. And we acknowledge that the wasteland passed from indigenous to non-indigenous control is through a violent history of genocide, dispossession, displacement, um, all of which remain unfortunately continuing. But also to emphasize that land acknowledgement by themselves are not enough, but need to be followed by action building solidarity. While people are joining us via Zoom, and we hope that more people will come, I would just like to give you some information about the day we expect today to go. After the talk, we will have time for questions from both the in-person people as well as the Zoom audience. And for those of you on Zoom, we encourage you to put questions in Zoom's Q&A function at any time during this talk. And also for people joining us on Zoom, the chat is now open live, and we would love to have any of you joining remotely on Zoom to introduce themselves there. The chat will also be live near the end of the session for resources or thoughts that you would like to share. And when you leave the webinar, a very short survey will pop up, and we would be very grateful if you could take a few minutes to fill it out. As for you, those of you here in the room, you will find a brief event feedback form on your seats, and we really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to fill it out before you leave. Just final kind of announcement that this event is being recorded and the video will be available on the consortium website and YouTube channel. So now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Anna De Conde. Anna De Conde is a postdoctoral fellow for the program on the study of gender, the study of women gender, and the Jandom Center for Community Engagement. She is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in feminist theory and engaged ethnographic research. Her research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of political anthropology and feminist studies and focus on security, conflict, justice, and collective action. By bringing a gender perspective to how communities develop communal projects of security and self-governance, her work sheds light on novel security strategies led by women through processes of collectivity and solidarity that are often go unnoticed. As a public scholar, Ana Di Conti has collaborated with grassroots organizations in Mexico. She developed communal popular action projects that focus on human rights and justice. She has served as a consultant on national and international research projects that focus on gender-based violence and insecurity across Mexico and Latin America. Today, Dr. Dil Conde will present a talk, very kind of creative title. Lunchtime, I'm getting hungry. Avocados, strawberries, and methamphetamines, a story of global consumption and local resistance in Michoacán. Please join me in welcome Dr. Conde.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Amani. And thank you everyone for being here today, Carol Khan for the invitation to participate in this talk, and everyone in the consortium, Claire, for all the help with the logistics. And everyone that is joining us here today, physically and virtually, I really appreciate your interest in this talk and my work. So yes, I chose an interesting title for my work today and what I'm going to be talking about. But through this title, I'm hoping to sort of explore or problematize some of the global interconnections that we have, particularly focusing in the relationships between Mexico and the US, but bringing a specific focus to what is happening in a particular region, the Purépecha region in Michoacán. So through this focus, what I'm trying to do is address some very general questions. What are the political, social, and economic inequalities that underlie the movements of these products? And for today, I'm going to be focusing on avocados, berries in general, although I thought that calling it strawberries would make just a bit of a punch, and methamphetamines. How are questions of insecurity and environmental crisis linked to the movement of these products and the consumption of these products between these two countries? And then, more importantly, what does a feminist perspective tell us, or what does it allow us to explore about these relationships that are produced and this environmental crisis and these processes of insecurity? And to do that, I'm going to focus on analyzing a discourse that we've been hearing recently in the media about the relationship between these two countries. And obviously, it's not the only way to approach this topic, but I thought it would be interesting to use that as the starting point to explore the complexity of these processes. So what's the discourse that we've been hearing recently? On the one hand, we've been hearing that Mexico is not doing its job controlling organized crime and the drugs that they bring to the US. We've also heard that Mexico is not doing its job securing the border and the migration flows coming from the south. So that is part of what the discourse has been telling us. We've also heard that with an imposition of 25% of tariffs, that will make the Mexican government to start of sort of doing a better job in these two regards. And also through the imposition of this category of terrorist to drug cartels, we will, well, the US government will put even greater pressure on the Mexican government and will even allow for military intervention to control sort of this situation. And that is what we've been sort of hearing in very general, broad strokes. But then what I want us to do is I want to challenge that narrative and to see how this is a simplified narrative, that if we approach these topics from this perspective, there's so much that can get lost. And it assumes too many things that if they are forgotten, then we don't really see or notice how it's having impacts on very specific groups of people. So I want to sort of break apart what is the simplification that I notice in this narrative. And again, these are only 4 points that I'm going to highlight, but there are many other simplifications that we can find here. First of all, there is this assumption that there is an absolute division between the legal and the illegal. And it just assumes that there are just 2 different worlds living within this sort of world, but just in very 2 different categories. The other thing is that it's assuming that this is a unilateral situation. So here, Mexico is the one at fault by sending crime, sending drugs, sending migrants, and Mexico is the country that needs to sort of attend this thing. Then in this simplified narrative, we also see that securitization becomes the only solution to attend these issues. And here by securitization, I mean all of those processes through which a social concern becomes a security issue. And just to give you an example of how that happens is, for instance, whenever we think about drug consumption, and it's a health issue, it's a social issue, but too quickly it can become, by politicians, it can be turned into a security concern. And then to control it, they use the military or they use security forces instead of thinking of other perspectives in which they can deal with the movement of drugs. Or another example is migration. Migration is a social issue, but very suddenly they turn it into a security concern, and the way they deal with it is by militarizing the border. So that's what we mean by securitization. And then the other component of this simplified narrative is that it assumes that it is affecting society in a homogeneous way. Everyone is affected in the same way, instead of actually looking at the many layers that are taking place and how society is experiencing these processes from very different regions and very different positionalities. So what I'm going to do in this talk today is, first of all, I'm going to challenge this simplification of the narrative to then explore what are the realities and how this is being experienced in Michoacán. And the reason why Michoacán is relevant to these discourses that we're hearing here in the US is because Michoacán is one of the main exporters in Mexico of the products that we consume here in the US, avocados, methamphetamines, and strawberries. And it's also the region where the strongest securitization strategies have been implemented in Mexico. So it is important to think about this space in terms of the movement that it's creating of people and of products. So let's first analyze the first sort of simplification, which is the absolute division between the legal and the illegal. And to do this exploration, I want us first to focus on legal products in a legal economy. And so far, we can simply go to the supermarket whenever we feel like it and buy avocados and strawberries. And I hope that none of you have ever felt at risk because you were consuming some of these products. And this is because they are within what we understand as the legal economy. We can just consume them whenever we want, and they are within the shelves of the supermarket. But to understand how the legality happens in these products, we need to explore what is the process of production of these concepts, of these 2 products. So to understand that, we need to look a bit back in history to understand the process that has allowed for avocado and strawberries to be grown in Mexico. And I don't have much time to expand on the historical processes of the economy of Mexico, but it suffices to say that in the past 40 years, the country has faced a process of neoliberalization of its economy, of its politics, and its processes. So we moved 40 years ago from a model that was focused on import substitution industrialization, which was mainly focused on like the internal production of things for the economy and to sustain the economy within Mexico, to then start moving towards more of a globalized economy. And through that globalization, there was this neoliberalization. So in Mexico, how did that look? something that happened was that in the early 90s, there was a change in our constitution through an agrarian reform, which allowed for peasant and indigenous land to be sold as private land. So this protection that we had of communal land started to be sort of opened up to private interests. And along with that possibility of privatizing land, we also created the North American Trade Agreement between the US and Canada, which also sort of expanded the economy of the country and allowed for the production of internal goods within the country to then be sold to these other countries. So it was sort of an interest of expanding the economy and bolstering Mexico's economy, but obviously with a lot in stake through those processes. And something that happened after this, which has been labeled the Washington Consensus, was that there was this shift yet again to something that has been called the commodity consensus. And what it means is that the governments in a lot of Latin American countries, and this is something that has been happening in Mexico as well, is that these governments have started to focus a lot more on developing and bolstering their economies through extractive industries. And just by sort of expanding any possibility of agriculture, turning it into agribusiness or extractive industries like mining, and sending all of those natural resources abroad to sort of produce and bolster the economy. But obviously there is at risk there. So let's see how that looks more in the ground. This is a map for you to sort of see where is the region that I'm talking about. Michoacán is on the western part of Mexico, and I'm focusing particularly in the Purépecha region, which is a region where indigenous peoples, Purépecha people, live, and where a lot of these issues are happening. And the images that you're going to see now are focusing on the red quadrant. So just for you to have an idea of where we're placing ourselves spatially. So these are two images of this region looked from a satellite and the lake region that is called because of the Pátzcuaro Lake. And you can see the difference between 1990 and 2024. And from these images, it might not be too clear what's going on the ground, and it might be not so clear how deforestation is happening, but just I want you to pay attention on the lake. So the lake is at the center top of the image. And as you can see, in 1990, we had a pretty healthy Pátzcuaro Lake, whereas in 2024, the lake is drying up and disappearing. But let's move to a closer image of this region to see how this actually takes place. So now I'm focusing on that tiny square of the region. It's a close-up of that area. And this is taking place in Uruapan, which is one of the sort of largest cities in this area, where it's called as the avocado Mecca. So let's see how the land changed between 2007 and now. So this is 2012, 2014, 2016, 2019, 2020, 2022, and 2024. All of these are avocado orchards in this particular forested land, and the forested land was entirely replaced in order to produce avocados for the consumption. And something that I want to sort of highlight here are all of those tiny sort of pools that you can see mushrooming across the area. Those are called ollas de agua, which are large cisterns that are used to hoard water in order to be able to support avocado production. Because avocados require the same amount of water that one full-grown avocado tree requires the same amount of water than 4 to 8 full-grown pine trees. So it requires a lot more water. So to be able to sustain this production, they need to start hoarding water. So this is an image of how that sort of commodity consensus is taking place on the ground and how it's changing the whole environmental setting in this region. And now let's focus on the same, but for strawberry production. So now I'm focusing on the northern part of the Purépecha region where strawberries and berries in general are cultivated. And this is an image of 2007. And now I want you to start paying attention to the white greenhouses that start mushrooming in the area. So as you can see, there's a few of them mushrooming in the northern part of this area. But then all of a sudden, they start appearing all throughout this territory until the whole area is completely covered by greenhouses. So it's an expansion of greenhouses that are necessary for the production of strawberries and berries in general, which are then consumed both by Mexico society, but are mostly exported to other countries. So now let's see how that looks in numbers, because now that we've seen the images of what it takes to produce this, let's see how much has the production of this product sort of expanded. So between 1990 and 2016, the area dedicated to avocado cultivation in Michoacán almost tripled. And between 2001 and 2018, Michoacán lost over 666,000 acres of forested land. As I was saying, one mature avocado tree uses as much water as it's actually 14 mature pine trees. And Mexico grows 32% of all the avocados that are consumed across the globe. So they are the main avocado producers in the world. And 80% of the avocados that are produced in these lands actually come here to the US. And thinking about how this has benefited Mexico in economical terms, Mexico's avocado exports amounted to just over $3 billion in 2023. So it's a massive industry that is obviously attractive to the people to invest money in this just because it seems to pay back to a certain extent. And now let's look at the berries market. So 60,000 acres of agricultural land have been covered by greenhouses in Michoacán to produce berries. And 54% of the water that is used in these greenhouses is wasted just because of the chemical processes that growing berries take. So it's not even used, but it's actually just wasted. Greenhouses also produce 70,000 tons of plastic waste every year in order to be able to keep on producing the berries. And Mexico's berries exports amounted to just over $700 million in 2022, and it includes strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries. And Michoacán is responsible for over 50% of this production. So how does illegality happen in this process? Something that is important to take into consideration is that, of course, the Constitution allowed for indigenous and peasant lands to be sold and privatized. But as you saw, a lot of the production that is taking place for avocado cultivation isn't only in communal lands or what used to be communal lands, but it's actually in natural reserves. So people are plundering the forests in order to be able to keep up with the amount of demand that there is of avocados in the region. And we tend to think of the supply chain as something happening separately, where we assume that it is the growers, the ones who are okay with plundering the land and then just selling the avocados separately to the people. But something that we need to understand is that actually the supply chain is usually reduced to only 3 actors, where we have the growers first, and then we have large transnational companies, a lot of them coming from the US, and who are responsible for packing, exporting, and importing the product and then selling it to different retailers. So here in the US, they sell it to Walmart or Trader Joe's or wherever you buy your avocados and strawberries. But by shortening that supply chain, what it means is that people within these larger companies know where the products are coming from and choose to disregard what is happening in the land and what's happening in the territory, as long as they can continue sort of expanding this market and supplying the demand. So that is one of the parts of the illegality. But then we also have this other part of illegality, which are illegal economies. And there is this tendency to assume that illegal economies are just 2 very separate spheres, like the legal and the illegal, and that they never touch one another. But we need to remind ourselves that all the money that is produced through the selling and the production of illegal goods, it's actually inserted in our legal economy in such a way that to assume that the two spheres are separate is trying to deny the reality that our legal economy at many times is sustained by illegal economies. And here I use Rita Segato, who is an Argentinian anthropologist who does a big analysis on this, on her perspective of the junction between legality and illegality. And what she says is that an endless series of illicit businesses produce massive sums of undeclared capital, and all of these forms of economy, which have such an importance, are inevitably involved in sectors of the legal economy. So it cuts across all the economic strata. So to think of them as separate spheres is just a mistake. And then let's move to the other narrative, which is that of the unilateral situation. So all of the stories always come assuming that the Mexican government is at fault and the movement of goods, it's only Mexico pushing products up and pushing people up north. But in reality, this is something that happens in combination between the two countries. And for there to be the supply, there has to be a demand of both legal and illegal products. And also, I won't have time to go through this, but most of the weapons and guns that are being used in Mexico to defend the territory or by drug cartels are being supplied by the US. So here it is important to think about the movement of products and not just to think that products are only being sent up north. But let's focus particularly in our three products to see how this sort of combination of demand and supply is happening and what are the impacts. So let's think about of these images of how the land has been deployed, just destroyed to be able to produce this. And interestingly, as the lands were as avocado orchards and strawberry greenhouses were expanding in this region, so was the demand for these products here in the US. So here in the US, Americans eat three times as many avocados as they did 2 decades ago. So, and just to look at the graph below, we can see how the US, this is a graph that is showing the amount of avocados that are exported every year by like importance of country. And we can see how the US imports a lot of avocados to fulfill the demand that it has. So the United States imported a record of 1.4 million tons of avocados in 2023, representing about 90% of the fruit supply here in the US. So the US manages to produce 10% of their supply, but the other 90% has to be imported, and it is imported mostly from Mexico, but not only from Mexico. And then looking at the market of strawberries, since the 1970s, Mexico has been the main supplier of berries in the US, and it represents 92% of US strawberry imports. And berry exports from Mexico to the US represented 97% of their global exports of the berries in 2016. And between 2000 and 2015, the rate of consumption of berries per capita here in the US doubled. So for avocado, it tripled, and for berries, it doubled from 5.31 to 10 pounds per person. And again, we can see here in this chart how the US also has such a huge demand for berries in general in comparison to other countries that also have big demands for these products. And now let's focus in our other product that I haven't paid much attention in this talk, which are methamphetamines. Now here we will also notice that the market for methamphetamines in this country has expanded in the past 2 decades. So the number of people 12 years or older reporting use of methamphetamine in 2019 was 2 million. And in 2016, it was only 1.4. So this is also a product that is highly demanded within this country. And this is something that we can trace in terms of the impacts that it's having on people for in the death rate for overconsumption of these drugs. So if we look worldwide, this is a map that is showing the number of people who died of an overdose on amphetamines in general and methamphetamines, which are part of amphetamines, in 1990. And then we can see the same map in 2021, just to notice the amount of consumption that people are having of drugs in general across the globe, but also how it's impacting the US in particular. So now let's move to this idea of securitization as the only solution now that we've seen like these other sort of layers of the narrative. When we think about securitization as the only solution, there is this tendency to assume that with military forces, we will be able to solve this problem. But something that we don't take into account is how the violence in this region is actually necessary to support and bolster this market demand. And here I like to recuperate this quote that says that violence is a constant of capital accumulation. For these markets to be able to exist, there needs to be terror, there needs to be panic, there needs to be this force of insecurity, making people fear for their lives, for them to be able to be dispossessed of their territory. And this is something that Don Paley has analyzed for a very long time, focusing on how what we call a war on drugs, not a drug on war, which would be, yeah, interesting, but no. The war on drugs has always sort of used that framework to then dispossess people from their territories. So it isn't about prohibition or drug policy, but instead, as she says, it's about the processes through which terror is used against the population. And while parallel to this terror and panic, there are policy changes, and there are many sort of movements underground that are facilitating for the investment of these larger capitalist products and for economic growth. So the two always come hand in hand. And that is something that we see in Michoacán. Michoacán was the first state where all the security processes were implemented when Felipe Calderón in 2016 decided to declare a war against drugs in the country. And ever since, we have continuously seen different security strategies and mechanisms being called and brought to this specific area of the country, while we are also looking how the territory is being destroyed by all of these economic interests. And here I focus on avocado and strawberry, but the same we can see in terms of minery happening in the southern part of the state. So it is important to see how these layers are connected and how this idea of securitizing specific spaces have an impact on the well-being and on the environmental and the resources that exist in these spaces. And now let's move to this final point of assuming that issues affect society in a homogeneous way. And I think this is very important to start understanding how everything we just saw in the other three sort of simplifications of the narrative are affecting people within this area and in these communities. So here I want to use this idea of repatriarchalization of territory. And this is a concept that came up from different collectivities working across Latin America that are exploring how these extractive processes take place in the region. And what they say is that for this dispossession and this destruction to happen, all of this is framed through a very patriarchal structure and a very masculinist sort of structure of how these relationships need to take place. And here I'm going to break it into sort of 4 dimensions. The first one is the security dimension. Why is it important to think about like how these processes are raised and are gendered and are sexualized from the security dimension? First of all, because as I was explaining, the violence is not a coincidence. For the violence to be happening in these regions, it's not that it happened out of the blue, but it's actually intentional. And within the security dimension, something that's happening on the ground is that security is being constructed by showing like the amount of guns and weapons that you can bring to the region. And this is true for every different sort of form of security structure that is being integrated to the area. So this is true for drug cartels that are bringing all the weapons and all this power to show how they can control the region. But this is also true in terms of how civilians are arming themselves to protect the territory and also to display this amount of power that they have with weapons and guns. And this is also true coming from the state apparatus and how the state and through the police and through the military is coming with all of this sort of showing all of this power with weapons. And in that security dimension, what is lost is how people are actually becoming more and more and more insecure. Then the other one is the economic dimension. And this is very important because when we think about how this sort of expansion of the agribusiness is escalating in this space, it becomes very attractive for people to participate in these networks. It becomes attractive because it represents money. So it represents money for people to just give up their land for a few thousand pesos in order to be able to survive. But it's also attractive for people to integrate themselves and work in these orchards and work in these greenhouses because it gives them a source of income. And something that happens in Mexico that is very, very similar to what happens in the US is that agricultural labor is raised and it's gendered. So all the people who are doing this labor are people who have been constantly marginalized by economic and social structures. So it's always indigenous peoples working in this land. It's always peasants working in these lands. And it's always women doing the labor in strawberries and in these massive greenhouses and being impacted health-wise because of all the chemicals they have to work with. And it's men working in the avocado orchards and exposing themselves to all the irregularities of these systems. And something that I just want to sort of highlight as well here is that this isn't specific to Mexico. This sort of processes of production is something that happens here in the US as well, in terms of who does the job and who works on what. And then I also want to highlight the body dimension. And here in terms of body, I want to signal 3 different layers of how bodies are being impacted by these processes. And it's important to think about bodies because then you actually bring people like physically to mind and how this is having an impact. So at the body level, how are people being sort of affected by these processes? First of all, as I was saying, health-wise is having a big impact because of people, how they work in these greenhouses and how that is having an impact on their health. For women in particular, that is having an impact on their reproductive system, and it's leading to a lot of miscarriages in the region because of the amount of people who are working in these spaces. But also on body dimension, something that is happening is that methamphetamines aren't only traveling up north for the consumption and demand here in the US, but there is a market that is also being opened in this region for people to consume methamphetamines to be able to survive the amount of work that it implies, the production of all of these goods. And finally, there is a third body dimension that takes place, which is the impact that women are facing in particular through gender-based violence. And we tend to think about gender-based violence as a problem that is completely separate from these structures, or there is the assumption that it's only organized crime, the ones who are producing the violence. But if we start sort of analyzing this together and thinking about how gender-based violence happens in these spaces, the bodies of women are the most affected by this conflict because they become sort of the source of the violence within their homes, within their communities, from all the forces that are coming from outside, from these economic demands. And all of that is usually invisibilized by the stories that we hear of drug conflicts being only between men. And it is true that men are really affected by these conflicts as well, and that men tend to be the victims of violence between organized crime. But women are also sort of the bearers of that violence in a story that tends to be invisibilized. And finally, obviously, there is the ecological dimension. And in terms of ecological dimension, I won't delve much into how it's impacting the land, but it suffices to say that it's drying up the lakes, it's deforesting the whole region, it's bringing pests to the bits of land that are still available, and it's just affecting the territory where indigenous communities live. So for the last 10 minutes that I have of the talk, I want to focus on how this is being resisted, because this is happening, but at the same time, this doesn't mean that people are just accepting it as a reality, but there are a lot of groups of people fighting against these processes and producing sort of alternatives to these realities. So what are the alternatives that we find in these areas? First of all, there has been a lot of indigenous resistance that has been pushing for processes of self-determination and autonomy. And through these processes, they have been able to recuperate the territory and protect it. Of those communities, there are two that have been very famous within Mexico, but also at the international level, the community of Cheran and the community of Nurio, because both of them have been recognized as autonomous indigenous communities. And what that means is that now they have full control of how security is structured within these specific territories. And something very interesting about those projects is that in that process, they have also developed sort of strategies for the reforestation of the lands and for the recuperation of the natural resources. And both communities have like strict laws in terms of avocado production. So there are no avocado orchards or strawberry greenhouses in these regions as a way of making sure that they are protecting the territory. But moving beyond those two cases, I want to move to two others that are very specific and that are sort of more at the micro level and tend to not be part of, again, the discourse. And it is how women in this region are organizing themselves to produce other forms of security that do respond to their realities and to their needs, but more importantly, to a connection with the territory and the land. So it's not only about defending themselves or defending their territory, but it's about connecting with the land in a way in which they are recuperating their traditional knowledge and they are sharing it across the communities. And for this one in particular, I want to focus on the Foro de Mujeres Purépechas que Luchan. The Foro de Mujeres Purépechas que Luchan, which is the forum of Purepecha women who's in struggle, started in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. And something that was happening with the pandemic was that gender-based violence sort of started to expand and have like a stronger effect on women in Mexico, as it happened in many places of the world. And women decided that they had to gather and start sharing strategies and start communicating with one another about their experiences in order to understand how there was a shared narrative, but also to produce sort of forms of change. And since that initial gathering in 2020, which was integrating women from all the different regions of the Purepecha region, from the different communities, women have been creating these forums every 6 months ever since as a way of continuing to produce that network and to share those knowledges. And here I want to highlight how through these forums they are producing other ways of understanding security and producing security. First is that they present security as something that should be done from, with, and for the community. So instead of thinking of security as an individualized sort of process in which we need to protect citizens, here it is produced through the community, in conversation with the community, and to understand what are the community needs and how people are being impacted differently, and also how they understand or what they understand security to be. So this is an open conversation that it's very much necessary to understand what people are experiencing at different layers. Then the second one is that the struggle for the defense of the territory, for the protection of the land, is linked to the struggle of defending and protecting women's bodies. And here, Latin American indigenous feminists have coined the idea of the body as a territory, or the body territory. And this category is very important for indigenous feminists who are fighting against the dispossession, because what they claim is that the first territory that should be protected and defended are women's bodies. Women's bodies are the first territory. And the reason why they coined that is because over the years in history, women's bodies have been the target of violence and of dispossession. So if they protect their bodies and if they show how the bodies are connected to their territories, then they can start sort of making visible how that dispossession has taken place, but also while making it visible, finding ways in which the community can recognize the relevance that women's bodies have and start protecting them as a community and not as something that is separate or just something that happens to women, because that is how things should be. Then the third one, which is also very important, is through these forums, they're not happening separately to the processes of self-determination or autonomy that indigenous communities are producing. But for them, self-determination is at the center of these processes. And the way women mention it is that an autonomy without women wouldn't be an autonomy. So they are claiming that it is important to include their voices, to include their needs, and to explore what's happening to them in order for the self-determination of these indigenous peoples to actually be complete. And finally, they are working through different strategies to reconnect with the land and the territory. And this has been particularly important in the past 2 years because at the beginning in 2020 till 2023, these forums were happening in open spaces, in public plazas, in different communities across the region as a way of expanding the conversation and inviting anyone who was in that space to come and share and learn from one another through these forums, which usually took 3 days across 3 different sort of days. But starting in 2024, the levels of violence in the region have spiked so much that it's become impossible for women to occupy these public spaces without putting themselves at risk. So now what they are doing is that they're moving these forums to their plots to work the land. And by sharing the knowledge that they have, they are creating bank seats. They are creating different strategies to relearn how to work the land. And by working with the land, by doing their small milpas, which is growing maize, which is growing squash, growing beans, they are recuperating the knowledge that they have. They're also creating small plots with medicinal plants, and they are learning how to use them, and they're sharing that knowledge to face different sort of maladies that they have. And through all of that knowledge, they're going back to a different process that is sort of protecting their realities within a territory that is extremely violent and that is facing many sort of layers of extraction, dispossession, and violence. And thinking about where I started with this talk and exploring sort of how what is the discourse that we've been hearing in the media nowadays. I want to recuperate sort of the process, sort of the story that I've been telling you in terms of how illegality is produced, in terms of how security is produced, in terms of how through all of these larger narratives, we lose focus of how this is happening on the ground. And by being able to open more space to share these other stories that are happening in these territories that are actually working together to produce something different, we can really start disrupting these very unilateral and simplified stories that we hear about how insecurity is produced. So my invitation is to continue opening more spaces to share more of these stories and to problematize these very simplified narratives that we hear in the media. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for such a very rich and really inspiring talk. We have a little bit over 20 minutes to take questions. We'll start with some of the people here in the room. We also encourage our the people on Zoom. Please post your questions to the Q&A tab of Zoom, and don't forget to introduce yourselves, and we'll be able collecting the Zoom questions after the first round here. Please raise your hands if you have any question, comment, thoughts for Anna, and don't forget to introduce yourselves as well.
Hi, my name is Betsy Sweet. I'm an associate dean in the School for the Environment, and thank you for an amazing, awesome talk. It really was just hit on so many points of some of my own work, but just generally in humanity and where we need to really move ourselves. So it's sort of a question comment. I would love to hear a little bit more about the idea of the body and the territorio cuerpo tierra, which I do some work in as well. Thinking about how is there a way to sort of put that front and center? It was in your list, but is that a place to really start to shift these narratives and to really get away from these big, huge abstract narratives that invisibilize all of these things? Can we get to that space, and how are you able, what is your thinking on how that could happen? I mean, it seems like this is a big part of the work, and I see the green bandanas, like that's very symbolic of what a big shift in Mexico, but how can we talk more about bodies?
All right. So the question is about the body as it links to the territory and territorial kind of integrity, and how could that be put at the forefront of the debate around Mexico and the body rather than kind of a private individual matter. Yeah. But we'll just repeat the question to the Zoom.
Okay, yes, I will do. That is a very important question, and I think that not only in academic settings, but in life in general, whenever we are approaching these questions of security and of violence, we tend to forget about bodies. We tend to, because we create this sort of stories about what's happening, it's very hard to connect with how these things are having an actual impact on people and how people are experiencing these processes. So for me, in my very own academic sort of work, I've always tried to bring the bodies of people into the parts that I work. This time I didn't do it as much because there was so much to cover in terms of how this happens. But connecting that relevance of sort of focusing on the stories of people, of bringing that to the front, to this other form of knowledge that is coming from indigenous territories, recuperating this sort of notion of the body as territory, there is a tendency to assume that that is just like figurative speech for indigenous communities. And something that I want us to understand is that it's not a figurative speech. It's actually the way they see their bodies connected to the territory where they live. And I think that if we manage to bring that to the surface and to give the importance that that has, to understand why bodies are connected to the territory and how for Purepecha and indigenous knowledge that is the case, then we will start giving more relevance to the knowledge that is being produced in these spaces, not as something that is sort of regional or local or provincial that we tend to sort of think of indigenous knowledge as provincial, but as something that is at the center of the protection of the territory. If we connect the body, then it doesn't become just a plot of land that is being deforested or that it's being destroyed, but it's a whole livelihood that is being destroyed along with the knowledge that comes with it, along with the connections that people have with it. So for me, that is like sort of one of the main reasons why it's so relevant to sort of bring this to the center. And then something that people have asked me is how is the work that women are doing, how is sort of attending the plots or talking about body territory going to control drug cartels, or how is it going to put an end on security? And I think that that is a misunderstanding of how these processes take place, or a simplification. But I do think that the mere fact that these processes exist is such an important step to naming how experiences are happening. And if we can pay more attention to how those are being named, then we can sort of start producing, it can expand in terms of our understanding and how we produce those discourses. Any other questions here in the room?
Any more questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
My name is Araceli.
The mic, please.
Oh,
Just for the Zoom people.
my name is Araceli. I just want to thank you for your presentation. I also have rich roots in Michoacán. But I have a question with these issues that are occurring in Mexico, specifically the region that you were mentioning. Is she making any promises or any changes towards the issues that are occurring?
I'm going to repeat
you
the
know.
question. Yes, I'm going to repeat the question because we need to repeat it for Zoom. So Araceli is asking if the current president in Mexico is making any promises or policies or any changes towards the situation in Michoacán in particular. And not that I've heard of. Something that did happen 4 or 5 years ago is that Michoacán's governor is with Morena, which is the sort of main political party that is in power right now in Mexico. So there is more of a conversation between the security strategies being developed by the governor. But I think that because of that same reason, there seems like they left him to do the work from what I've seen so far. But I think that connecting it back to this idea of the commodity consensus, something that happens is that this interest in extractive industries, this interest in the agribusiness isn't something that comes from governments only on the right. It's actually something that has been implemented by most governments across Latin America, also from the left. So this idea of bolstering the national economy based on the intense production of specific products is something that most governments have supported. And because of that, I think that sort of shows how, although in discourse there is apparent there is this apparent need of controlling the insecurity that is happening or the violence that is happening in certain regions. At the same time, there is this continuous bolstering of this agro-industry, which at many times is linked with organized crime in various levels. So I haven't seen any changes throughout the whole time I've been working in Michoacán. So since 2011 until now, I've seen just new security strategies, but it's just like they are recycling exactly the same ideas over and over and over again. So thinking about Bedoya, the current governor in Michoacán, what he did was he super armed all the police forces, like indigenous police forces, all like it just gave like an immense amount of weapons to protect themselves. So they are now like with this massive trucks and everything, like super professional, but it's just going back to the same idea of how security should be solved through just, yeah, the security militarization.
Do we have Zoom questions? Can you read the?
May Graham asks, is there a way we can support these women from wherever we are in the world?
Yes. So they're asking if there's anything that can be done to support women in any part of the world. Women in Michoacán, but from any part of the world. Yes, thank you for the clarification. So I have a tendency, and this is a very personal position that I have, that is to stop assuming that we can help someone that is thousands of miles away from us and instead focus more on local strategies that can be deployed to support women around us. Because although it is very attractive to think that there are things that we can do to support that, or even I could say, well, stop consuming avocados or stop consuming strawberries. But that would be the case for every product that we consume nowadays. So the fact is that we have an overconsumption problem as a society, and also that all of the products that we consume have a dark side. Like that is just the way our system operates nowadays. And because of that, I won't hold to that moral story of stop consuming avocados. Like we need to dig deeper as a society to understand why we're doing what we're doing and why we're structuring the things the way we're structuring it. But also in terms of how to support women, I think that it is easier to continue connecting at the local level with the processes and the disparities and the dispossessions that are happening in the places where we live, to then start producing networks that can connect and can create conversations between different processes. And I think that that can create something way more productive than trying to help someone who is very far away from us and disconnected from our reality, because then we're just producing band-aids instead of actually producing sustainable changes. But this is my own personal philosophy.
I have another question from Zoom from Jaina Kanan, who thanks you for sharing, and has a follow-up question to the first question about body as territory. She asks, I'm having a hard time separating territory from the capitalist context in which we're using it, wherein territory is something that can be bought, used, extracted from. I'm wondering if you could please expand upon how the language of body as territory is framed as one inherent to autonomy and self-determination.
Okay, so that one is a different, difficult question to repeat, but Gina is asking if we can separate this understanding that we have from territory from our capitalist understanding as territory as a piece of space that can be bought, that it can be just used and exploited. And instead, how can we expand on this notion of the body territory to give a different meaning to territory? Am I correct? Okay. That is a big question. I think it's a big ontological question. I do think that it is true that the way we think about territory in our society is definitely as one more commodity that can be exchanged, that it can be just, it's part of the same economic system that we have. And the body territory does bring sort of a glimpse of how to think about space differently or land differently. And here it is hard to move between these concepts, because if we think territory from this Western perspective, it becomes a commodity. But if you talk to indigenous people about territory, territory becomes something with an entirely different ontological meaning to them, because territory connects to where all their ancestors are at. It is the land where their grandparents and great-grandparents and all of the knowledge they have produced is at, and where it's located. So I think that for us to recuperate that understanding of territory, we would need to sort of lay deeper roots in the spaces where we're at, or at least make an effort to connect to the spaces where we live, to understand what are their histories, what are the knowledges that have been produced in those spaces, and how are those knowledges relevant to what's happening today. And in that same vein, I think that we need to open space for other knowledges and other histories and other processes. So if we're going to recognize Massachusetts as an indigenous territory, as an indigenous space, what would that take for us to like move forward with that recognition? And I think it would be to understand how indigenous communities think about Massachusetts, how they have experience, how they connect with this land beyond just its commodity value.
Can we take Sway and who else has a question? Okay, so and Carol. So we'll take Sway and Carol, and then we'll see.
Great.
Sway.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Sui Wan, faculty member at WGS. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I see your intervention as twofold. One is to sort of in place this notion of security into how people actually understand them, because they tend to become anti-signifiers. And then the second intervention I see is that this broaden our perspective of insecurity, not as black and white, but also as a spectrum, expansive notions. But also, I wonder, between these two sort of large interventions, I wonder if, because securitization, we tend to think about it as synonymous as militarization of this, top-down process of, of government actions, or narrative-wise. But I wonder if if we can consider what you're describing happening in the community as also as a process of secretization, but from below, which I think might nicely connects these two large interventions that you're bringing together. So just wondering if your thoughts, if secretization can be also a concept that can be applied to these knowledges and experiences generally from below.
Can we take the Carol's question so that we combine them?
That was a long question, so I think I'm gonna let Anna repeat that and answer it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the question focuses on this idea of securitization as coming from a very top-down narrative and how it's produced, and correct me if I'm missing anything within the question. But then also thinking if it would be possible to bridge this concept of securitization to these other processes that are happening more on the ground, and this sort of the processes that are being developed by these communities and these groups as also being processes of securitization, but from a bottom-up sort of perspective. I've never thought of it that way, and I want to thank you for bringing that. One of the reasons why I've held to the concept of security, which is a very uncomfortable concept, just because, as you were saying, it's such a big signifier, but at the same time, it's such a top-down perspective that has always been given to these processes, is that first of all, it's how people within these regions talk about the situations they're experiencing and how they demand for security. So it's something that it's coming from the discourse. But also because I found that that was the only way to connect sort of the top-down strategies to analyzing how those top-down strategies are actually not connected to what's happening on the ground. So it was sort of creating a critique using the same tools or narratives that are coming from the top. I'm not sure if a bottom or non-hierarchical understanding of producing security could be called securitization. So my answer is I don't know, but it's a very interesting question that I would have to delve deeper to see if securitization always is tied to an idea of the state. And if that's the case, then this wouldn't necessarily would be called securitization. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes before the Zoom question, so it's yours, Carol.
Thank you, Carol Conde, Director of the Consortium. Thank you so much. It was a really fascinating and wonderful talk. Very complex analysis put together. I have a very discrete question within that. You talked about the repatriarchalization of territory, and you talked about 4 components of it. But I was wondering if you would talk more about the genesis of that concept. Where did it come from? How did it get here?
Yes, of course. So as I said, it's a concept that has been used by different collectivities across Latin America that are trying to make sense of these processes of land dispossession, particularly for indigenous and peasant communities. And it's coming from a feminist perspective or analysis. And what they are trying to make sense is how this territory dispossession is sort of bringing back patriarchy into the system through these different sort of layers. So it is, and that doesn't mean that the patriarchal system ever left these spaces, but it's just reshaping how those relationships are taking place on the ground. And the way it's reshaping them is through this different sort of dimension. So it is reshaping the economic dimension in terms of how people are interacting with land. So for instance, the fact that in many of these communities, women are not allowed to own land and therefore are not allowed to sell it, whereas men are allowed to do so, it shifts their relationship with the land in an economic perspective, and it turns territory into this commodity. So that is just one very specific example that they analyze in terms of how this territory dispossession is affecting that. And in that way, they analyze how the bodies of women are also affected in this sort of new understanding of how women need to interact within these spaces. Something that happens in the agribusiness and in minery as well that I didn't have space to analyze is how, because of the creation of these industries, there's also a demand for specific ways of using the women and the bodies of women. And so that creates a new layer within this territory dispossession through this repatriarchalization that didn't used to exist 40 or 30, 50 years ago in these areas. And so what they're trying to analyze, these are just like to keep it brief, but what they're trying to analyze is how the patriarchal system obviously was already there and it was already within these communities, but how these systems are sort of bringing a new structuring of those patriarchal relationships and are having an impact at different dimensions. And that doesn't mean that these systems are only affecting women, obviously, but it's just looking at how these are gendered and the gendered impacts that these structures have. Yeah.
Thank you. I can't help but just maybe inject myself here, but the feminization of territories and linking it to violence and gender-based violence has been invoked in several feminist kind of literature before, particularly in conflict zones, where the land is usually considered, or the motherland or the nation has been raped, but it has always done from a very simplistic and symbolic kind of way. That's why I really appreciate like the way that you are invoking this and kind of in a very complex but like maybe creative way where we can reclaim that kind of territory as a land rather than run away from it. And the problematic nationalistic kind of utilization of it. And I thank you so much. This is just an amazing, amazing kind of presentation. Thank you to all our audience here and to our Zoom audience. Really, on behalf of the consortium, the interns, Carol, and everybody, we really, really appreciate you. Just a fine reminder to those who are joining us via Zoom, thank you. Please remember to fill the survey, the online survey. And for everybody in the room, if you have not already done that, please fill the survey. It's very quick. It will only take a minute or so. And either leave it on the seats or at the table on your way out. Thank you, everybody, very, very much.